a lovely introduction. Thank you, Mike. Vicky and I are going to talk to you today about our work at gov.uk to make navigation journeys simpler and content easier to find. Now, so I'm going to talk about the problem that we're trying to solve, and Vicky will be going through kind of how we've approached our solution to that problem, and then we'll sum up briefly at the end. So gov.uk is unusual in two main ways. So firstly, we have to design a solution that works for everyone. And secondly, government content covers everything from day-to-day needs to emergency, to critical situations. And it's all important. So, what is information architecture? If I throw that in at the start, I'm not asking, some kind of existential question. The reason, actually, I wanted to put this here at the start is that there are so many definitions of IA that I thought it would just be useful for us to define it here as we begin. So I'm hoping everybody's got their IA book, their polar bear book. I don't have the page number, but here is the definition from that book. It says information architecture is a design discipline that's focused on making information findable and understandable. And of course, you can't do that unless you understand the needs of your users. So if we didn't care about users or user research, then actually there wouldn't be anything to say to you today. We'd have finished the project already, and I'd be skipping along and you'd all be going for a cup of tea. But where did we begin? So some of you may know that in 2010, Martha Lane Fox, she wrote a report for government in which she stated a principle that's been a guiding light for gov.uk. And she said, the user should not have to navigate the departmental structure of government before finding the service or content they need. Now at that point, every government organisation and department had its own website. There are hundreds of them, and also there was DirectGov, which we heard about, and BusinessLink. So content wasn't, and it couldn't be easily connected. Fast forwarding a bit, by the end of 2014, well, over 300 organisations had moved their content across to gov.uk, and it became the single domain for government. So we had a clear homepage and sensible categories, and pathways to the most needed information and services from across government. So journeys were connected. And now people didn't need to know about the organisational structure of government to have their needs met. And GDS, the Government Digital Service, had also published its design principles. Now, these are all important and they're all relevant to our work. But if you're doing any IA work, then you'll know that there's one here that encompasses a lot, which is number 4, do the hard work to make it simple. Well, given that we had clearly done so much and come so far, you might be wondering what else there was left to do. Hadn't we finished? Well, at that point, we'd actually only just begun. The challenge of moving all those sites across to a single domain in a relatively short space of time had inevitable consequences. There hadn't actually been time to organise it properly. And so browse patterns and frameworks that had worked well at the beginning, for a few departments, started to creak alarmingly as more sites closed and more content moved across. So it was a huge IA challenge, but one that couldn't properly be started until we knew what we had to deal with. So until all the content was on gov.uk, it was impossible to know what we really needed to do. So now we have over 300 organisations publishing to gov.uk. There's over 190,000 content items. And that content is growing all the time. So each month there's around 3,000 new pieces of content being published to gov.uk. And although we know what department published it, we don't necessarily know what it's all about. And this is complicated by the fact that it's not all the same kind of content. Some is really basic detail and some is very complex information. And it's not all about helping a user to complete a task. So some, like press releases and policy papers and research, that's actually what the government is doing and saying. And as we know, the government probably has quite a lot to say quite a lot of the time. And we've also ended up with 3 separate subject taxonomies, and they have gaps, and they're not connected, and not all content is tagged to them. So to illustrate this, here's 3 separate browse pages on gov.uk that pull together content which is about flooding. So one, on the top left, has got basic information on it. And then there's another next to it, which is information that's for specialists who really want to know the detail. And then there's a third one at the bottom, and that one is for people who want to know what the government is doing about the issue. But if I just want to find the latest information, which one should I go to? And if my job relies on me knowing this stuff, which one should I come back to? Which one should I bookmark? It's not clear. And of course, this equates to yet more complexity internally for the people actually creating the content, as they have to choose the right topic in the right vocabulary in the publishing system. So which one should I choose? What do they all mean? And which of those pages that I've just shown you would my content end up on? So what about our users? What about the people who actually use government information? Well, we have around 10 million visitors each week, and our users are everyone, the whole of the UK population, and that includes all of us. So if you're renewing your passport, you're running your business, or you're repaying your student loan, those are all very common needs. But some needs might be more unusual than you would think. So maybe you're thinking of buying a very cute, tiny little pig as a pet. So I was, but I'm not anymore. Because if you want to take one, if you want to take your little pig for a walk, then you'll need a license to do that. Or you'll be breaking the law. And maybe you want to become a childminder. So to do your job, you might need to register with government. And at the other end of the scale, it's not just about complying with government regulations. If you're a health professional, it's vital to be able to find the latest information easily. So making it hard to find and navigate around this kind of content can have real-life consequences. So the point is, these are, those are, if you like, might say that they're more obscure needs. They're not the common needs. But for us, the point is you can't just focus on those popular ones. You can't just forget about the long tail, the content that is rarely used, but it's still needed by someone. Because if government is the single and canonical source of that information, then we have both a duty to publish it and to make it findable. The other thing is that, like most sites, the majority of our journeys actually start in the content. On gov.uk, it's 3 out of 4. And these are the things that people say. But what else is there? And where can I go from here? And is this everything? So this, I hope, gives a bit of a flavour as to the problems we're trying to solve. So although all the content is now there on gov.uk, the reality is that the journeys aren't seamless yet. And so to fulfil, its potential for users, then we need to create an information structure that works across everything. So Vicky's going to tell you about her approach now.
Thank you. So how did we go about approaching these challenges? Well, I have to say we were quite tempted a lot of the time just to go and drink tea, like Alice just suggested, but instead we became part of the Finding Things team about a year ago. He's a photo of the team, and some of the team members are here in the audience today, which is very nice. It's an interdisciplinary team whose role is to fix search, navigation and orientation on gov.uk. And initially we spent a long time together trying to get to grips with the details of the problems that we're trying to solve. But from an IA perspective, we knew we also needed to take a big picture view of the whole ecosystem. The publishing workflows, the various tools, the taxonomy management, the end user interface, user needs, and so on. And the more complexity we discovered, the more we really knew we had to do the hard work to make it simple. If we were going to come up with a solution that was ever going to work, it had to be simple enough to explain to the rest of our team, simple enough to explain to the rest of gov.uk, simple enough to explain to all the organisations publishing their content to gov.uk, and of course, ultimately, simple enough for end users to understand in the front end. Well, you might say, surely the simplest thing would just be to have a really good search function. This is a screenshot of the alpha version of gov.uk from 2011, when search was the main mode of navigating on the site. And search is really important, and it's really useful, particularly for completing ad hoc tasks like how do I book my driving test or how do I register a birth. But sometimes people's information needs are more exploratory in nature, they're a bit less concrete. So if I was to become a new parent, I might ask what kind of financial help might I be entitled to from government. And in those situations, people often don't know exactly what they need or what language to use. And if you don't know that something exists, then you can't go looking for it, as this quote from some recent gov.uk user research illustrates. Also, as Gaynor said, we know that a lot of our users arrive on the site via Google search. But actually, once they get there, only a small minority of people use the site search. It's only about 6% of users. And that still gives us a lot of really rich search data, but it's only a small number of people. And we've often observed in user research that less confident digital users are far more likely to use browse than they are to search. And gov.uk has to cater for everyone in the UK population. Also, with the addition of lots of specialist content to the site, such as professional guidance for teachers or accountants, farmers, immigration lawyers, planners, health professionals, and specialists in the oil and gas industry, for example. There are people who need to see everything about the topic so that they can do their job properly. So, for example, if I'm responsible for keeping children safe in school, then I need to know that I've seen all the guidance. So we do know we need some form of subject browse in addition to search. But as Gaynor showed us earlier, we'd ended up with 3 different ways of browsing to content. So one of the first assumptions we came to as a team is that it would be better to merge these 3 taxonomies into one single comprehensive taxonomy for all the content on the site. And this immediately leads to simplicity in the front end because users will only have one subject browse system. But also it leads to simplicity in the back end because publishers will only have one list of terms when they come to classify their content that they have to choose from. And of course, the most important thing about the taxonomy is that it's based on user needs, not organisational silos, so that users can find all information relating to a particular topic, regardless of who published it. But a new taxonomy on its own isn't going to solve the problem. And there is a danger that the taxonomy work, sort of independently, could become quite an abstract and academic exercise, and we don't want to end up with a list of terms in a spreadsheet. The taxonomy can only provide the framework for the content to hang off, and it will only be of value to end users if publishers tag their content to it accurately and consistently. But training over 3,000 publishers across government just isn't an option, so the tagging interface and the concept has to be really, really obvious. So, as Silva was saying earlier this morning, our publisher users are just as important as our end users. There are lots of them. They're spread around the UK in lots of different organisations. Some of them may only need to publish 1 or 2 pieces of content to the site, maybe once or twice a year. Others of them will be publishing content to the site every single day. So we really need to understand the full spectrum of their needs too. So, for example, we ran a session specifically on tagging at the recent gov.uk content conference. We know we need to make it really, really easy for publishers to tag their content, but also really easy for them to understand the consequences of that tagging in the front end. But tagging and taxonomy only provide the foundation for an improved user experience. Although the taxonomy influences the navigation, it isn't the same thing. So the ways in which the taxonomy is used to display content to users in the front end will be crucial. And here the biggest challenge is to come up with some simple display rules and some consistent design patterns that will work across the unpredictable and often uneven coverage of content across the site. So we know we want to help users build up a mental model of how the site's structured so they can see what's available and how they can get around it. And we also need, because as Gaynor said, we know that many of our users arrive deep in the site on the page of content. At that level, we also need to provide clear pathways so users can see where they can go next. And in this way, we can better support user journeys through the site, connecting up content in new and useful ways. And these three aspects of the solution are separate but completely interdependent. They're all equally important. They all need to be aligned, and we can't consider one in isolation. And these things might all be true of any big IA project. But given the unique set of challenges that we face at gov.uk, our solution has to be so simple that it can scale easily, but also really, really flexible so that it can accommodate the different sizes and shapes of content we have to work with. And this idea of consistency but not uniformity is another of the GDS design principles. So that gives you an outline of the approach that we've taken so far. And at the end of last year, we started testing our ideas and our approach with all the education contents on the site. And our aim is to learn from this trial and then go back and iterate our approach based on what we find. And again, this is in line with another of the GDS design principles, which is to iterate and then iterate again.
Right, I'm not quite sure whether these are really tips, but they're things that we think are quite important. So yes, if you think about what we have done to date, just to see what we could pull out that might be of use if you are doing a big project with a big IA component in it. So the first thing, as I'm sure will please several of you in the room, is that content strategy is really important. You know, this defines how and why you're creating your content. And a good content strategy means that your content is going to be in good shape and it meets the needs of your users. So one of the first things we would say is that you need to look at the content that you're trying to organise. And we talked about who loves spreadsheets. Well, we don't love them, but it's a sad fact of our lives that we have to, look at quite a few of them. This is an inventory or a list of content that's all about teaching. Now we're pulling together these lists and then we're going through a process of auditing them. So the content teams are actually looking through them and seeing if they can see issues with the content. Because if your content is duplicated or is out of date or even it's just not clearly titled, then it's not going to help anyone find anything. It's, for us, the answer to making things easy to find really starts with the content. Now, we built a tool to help us do this. So this can be a really helpful thing. If you can build something that helps take away some of your kind of manual process, that's really great. So this tool that we have, it pulls together content that we find via search keyword queries and pre-classified content and merges it all together and makes it lovely. But it's worth remembering that things like this don't just magically work on their own. You still need people to look at that list of content and say, well, is this relevant? Is this really about this? Is this the right stuff that's coming back? And to think about what the queries that you're going to use in the first place. And again, search analytics, Google Analytics, we use a lot of that. We've gathered a lot of data about what people do on the site, where they arrive, what search keywords they use, and where they go next. But it's really important, I think, here, is to be clear about what you're asking and why, and how you're going to use the information. And don't underestimate the time it will take to properly analyse and act on your findings. Now, this is a photograph I took of our breakout area in GDS, Government Digital Service, and that's the sofa in the front. And the reason I took this is because our values are up there in the wall, but this one is really key. You can't do everything you know, and IA particularly does not exist in a vacuum or just on a spreadsheet. You need the expertise of your whole team to deliver it. Whether it's design, project management, tech, product leadership, content, subject expertise, data analysis, and of course, user research. And you all need to pull together. And it's not just about your internal team. It's really important to work with people around your organisation. Because if you want to make this sustainable into the future, this isn't just a project about now, your IA has to be something that lives in the future if it's going to be successful. So you have to build that goodwill and good communication habits from the start. And finally, and I appreciate that this is one that's quite hard to control in any organisation, but we are lucky in GDS that user research is valued very highly. And this is what we hope will make whatever solution we come up with be about the user and not just about the organisation. So back to Vicky.
So, where are we now? Well, we're still working through our first theme for education. To give you a sense of scale, the main organisations involved with education content have about 7,000 documents on the site at the moment. And that's out of a current total of 190,000. So it's only about 4% of the content, so clearly we still have a lot to go. And we're quite far off having all the answers. The success of the IIA depends on so many factors that are outside of our control. We can't do it on our own. We need lots of buy-in. We need organisations to develop and adhere to robust content strategies. We also need them to dedicate people and time to classifying their content well. We also need groups of organisations to start working together in new ways to make the cultural shift from grouping content by organisational function to grouping content by cross-organisational topics that reflect real user needs. So communication is a really big part of this project. And in terms of the longer-term sustainability of our model, we still have lots of open questions, particularly around governance. We know that our taxonomy, like all taxonomies, is a living thing that will change over time. But exactly how that part of the process will work and who will own which bits isn't clear to us yet. At this point in time, we have an idea of where we need to get to, but we don't yet know exactly which path we're going to take to get there. We do know, however, that the IA work we're doing now will be laying down the foundations for an improved user experience, whatever that may turn out to be. And I think this quote from John Fisher's blog sums this up really neatly. The need for logical, user-centric structures and taxonomies has never gone away. There's no doubt it's a big job and it's going to be hard work. The effort will be worth it in the end though, because it will help to deliver Martha Lane Fox's original vision, gov.uk. There's so much potential now to join up government information in new and meaningful ways for people, if we can get the basics right, and that's still very exciting. Thank you.